Hi, everyone. I'm Saher Naumaan. I'm from BAE Systems Applied Intelligence, where I work on the threat intelligence team. And I'm going to be talking to you today about how state-sponsored threat actors respond to public disclosure. So a couple caveats before we begin here. This is quite an interesting and difficult area to explore. And basically, short of asking the threat actors themselves, how they react and why, we kind of will never know. So just to caveat that these are observations based on our data and open source data, and we're kind of speculating as to what the reasons might be for the attackers' motivations for their responses. So yeah, this is just kind of an interesting trend that we saw over the years, and thought that we could categorize the different responses from state-sponsored attackers into kind of a nice timeline here, and with some examples. So just to start with an overview, disclosure is a major part of kind of investigating different threats, and as well as part of the cyber defense toolkit. So these are some high profile examples from both the government and private industry. And you'll see a range of different sources that disclose and a range of different motivations. So we're going to look at those motivations, how for disclosure, and then how attackers can respond to this, and some of the intended and unintended consequences of that disclosure. So there are a lot of factors to consider in any disclosure. Who is disclosing and why? And in relation to the attacker, what is being disclosed, attribution, and also how does the attacker respond to this? Lastly, there's consequences that can happen as a result. So from the perspective that we're talking about here in terms of cyber operations, the groups and motivations for disclosure are shown on the slide there. So highlighting government and industry, and improving defenses, imposing a cost. These are some of the kind of reasons. And different actors, entities will have different reasons for that disclosure. The nature of what is being disclosed can also vary. So there are kind of technical attribution levels where there's indicators provided, maybe TTPs, so tactics, techniques, and procedures of that particular threat group. And as far as political attribution, so potentially to a government agency or other kind of state entity. So there's different levels there. There's also obviously criminals and kind of other groups, which we won't discuss in this presentation. It'll be more state focused. And then threat actors respond in a variety of ways. So we've kind of categorized this into three different areas. So one of them is to go quiet and kind of, get spooked by the disclosure, or realize that their, activities have been burned, so they kind of go underground. They can change up their tactics, which means they'll, register different infrastructure or start using different malware, for example, so it won't be detected as per the disclosure. And then they could get angry, and I have some fun examples to show about what's happened when threat actors get kind of annoyed that you found them and reported on them. And then actually there is a fourth category technically, where the attackers don't do anything. They could see it, they could see the disclosure, they could not see it, but either way, it doesn't bother them. So they just keep going, regardless of the potential kind of detection and defense that would come after. So from a politics perspective, a government does disclose for a lot of the reasons given here. And there's kind of similarities with the motivation. And again, crucially, the attribution is to a state rather than just kind of a group name that we give them. So there's a lot of broader impacts and considerations if you're looking at when a government discloses, for example, as opposed to private sector. So that kind of includes things, again, around foreign policy and norms and what the protocol is for things, things like espionage versus sabotage operations. And often it can be signaling some kind of messaging to the other kind of adversary state as well. So we're going to kind of talk about all of these in the coming slides. And the first category is go quiet. So again, this is when attackers kind of either disappear entirely, maybe the group breaks up, or they just, we just can't find them anymore. That's also an option. So I will talk through a couple examples. Now, undoubtedly, a landmark moment for public disclosure of these kind of cyber operations was the Mondiant APT1 report in 2013. So while there was activity reported before that, as you can see in 2011, this landmark report was pretty significant because it was not only disclosing the activity that was seen by a private sector firm, but also it went as far as identifying a particular Chinese military unit and even the building that they operated in. So this was quite seminal in terms of disclosure, and especially something that you would usually only see from governments. So that kind of started this trend, and over the years we've seen a lot more disclosure from private sector groups as well as others. So we and the others, kind of other vendors, had been tracking the command and control activity used by the group at the time of the report, and had been studying the group for several years. It's one of the oldest threat groups that we'd known of. And overnight, following the report's release, the group's CNC activity completely stopped. So it was pretty, I like to caveat that correlation isn't necessarily causation, but based on kind of the visibility of all of these different companies, as well as kind of the lack of activity from the group, it was pretty significant that it impacted them. So the year after that, there were indictments from the US government and specifically talking about this group, APT1, as well as its victims, their targeting, how they operated, all that kind of stuff. And since then, there's been a lot of developments in Chinese espionage operations and the groups that we track. So that's kind of one of the biggest instances, and that led to kind of a lot more of disclosure over the years. So a similar pattern I'll talk about is with a different group, Iranian group called APT. Now, the disclosure here publicly was actually in December 2014 by Cylance. We had reported on this group maybe a year before privately, which again was just based on our normal kind of investigation and service. But publicly, this report kind of went into a lot of detail, even talked about personas, passwords, all the kind of operations that you'd expect to see. Now, after that, the group went quiet for a number of months. Later, there were multiple groups that emerged with overlaps to the kind of original intrusion set. And, it's difficult to prove. There's actually not necessarily hard evidence to say, well, Operation Cleaver went dark, they maybe split up, the members moved around, and then joined new groups, which emerged in the years following. So that's pretty hard to prove, but there are soft overlaps in terms of, TTPs, as well as like usernames and things that were reused. So that one's actually quite an interesting one, because it's kind of half go quiet and then for a while and then reemerge. So that was an example from kind of the Iranian side of things. Now, the second one is kind of more about the change up in the actors' behavior and operations as a result of disclosure. So this is the first example, which is Sophisy. You might have heard of APT28, Fancy Bear. So basically, there were a lot of public kind of reporting instances around this group over the years. They've been quite high profile, especially after the 2016 election. And have been quite active and reported on. So this is a good example of the change up, because there have been so many blogs and reports about their activity over the years. Over time, the group has evolved the tools and infrastructure to kind of keep up with that reporting and again, evade defenses. And some of those disclosures led to pretty sharp changes in how their infrastructure was set up. So depending on what was disclosed in those blogs or public reports and how detailed it was in terms of, are they just disclosing the activity or the indicators, or that actually talking through the kind of methods that they use to track that group, which again can be quite detrimental to defenders, as if you're outing those particular methods, the group might see it and say, oh, well, they clearly know how to find us. Maybe we need to change it up. So that did happen with this group. And in this case, there was a particular way of tracking SSL certificates to monitor SOPHC. And once that method was disclosed, that the attackers kind of realized that and decided, well, okay, we need to change that. So we're harder to find. So there's this continual evolution and cat and mouse game of defend and attack. That's a big part of this kind of cyber operations and investigations dynamic. So yeah, this happens with groups quite often. And because there's so much public disclosure, which it's increased a lot in recent years. So another example of disclosure is APT 10. Cloud Hopper was an operation name. And this was a couple of years ago where PwC, BAE, the NCSC, a bunch of different entities kind of came out with different reporting on APT 10, this Chinese espionage group that was particularly interested in managed service providers and would use the access to the MSPs to pivot into kind of customer networks. So this is an interesting case, basically following the release of these reports, and especially the kind of attention that it got. The group made a number of changes to the tools and infrastructure. So they changed up everything, became more OPSEC conscious. So being more careful in terms of their own security and trying to make sure that defenders couldn't track them. In 2019, there were US indictments. In the last couple of years, there were US indictments that came out specifically regarding this group, and that made the group go even more quiet. So, what we think about this group is that really APT 10, as it existed then a few years ago, doesn't exist now. And a similar thing could have happened, is that the group could have split up. There could be new groups forming and people move around, or they've entirely changed their game. So that was quite interesting. And this is a good combination example of government disclosure as well as private disclosure. So the last category is actually get angry, which is a pretty interesting one. And it's mostly harmless, but I guess in terms of what it could be, that remains to be seen, as we don't necessarily have examples of it, but there are some examples of almost petulant responses from threat groups, which have kind of come to light. So one example is an Iranian group called Charming Kitten. So Charming Kitten is very focused on credential harvesting and phishing campaigns, very much that side of things, rather than kind of malware and targeted intrusions as much. So they've been around for years, and the Iranian group kind of is quite active and consistent in their operations. And there's an Israeli company called Clear Sky that does a lot of investigation into the group. So interestingly, there was a point where Charming Kitten, based on the kind of disclosures that Clear Sky had done about the group, decided they were going to build a phishing website that impersonated Clear Sky. So they posted this, and again, it wasn't all the way functional. It wasn't. It didn't look like there were actually any successful kind of compromises based on this website. But basically, it looked like the attackers had just had enough and were fed up. So they decided to poke a little bit at Clear Sky and kind of say, look, well, we know what you're doing. We can see you tracking us, and we're not happy about it. Another one was actually quite interesting, and also an Iranian group called Muddy Water. So this was an interesting one. There was a Kaspersky kind of article that came out that talked about some different actors and listed them in terms of what they were studying and their activity reporting on them. It wasn't in any particular order. It was just a list of 5 or 6 actors basically. And Muddy Water kind of took this personally. I think they were number 3 potentially. And they released a YouTube video that they claimed to show a proof of concept for how to bypass the Kaspersky AV, which in that case, it actually wasn't. But they were, and they left a message that said they were irritated that why aren't we number 1, basically. Now, it's difficult to tell if that comment was actually left by Moneybodder, as well as the YouTube video, but the idea is that they saw the rankings, what they considered rankings, and decided, well, we're better than that. Why aren't we higher ranked? And so let's, stick it to Kaspersky. So that was kind of funny. And the last example was APT 10, which I just discussed. So in some of their operations, they had different, they had siloed operations. So some of them were targeting kind of different regions of the world. So in some cases, they were in one of the campaigns, for example, they left some Easter eggs, basically what we would call Easter eggs in the code of their malware. And they were mocking the security researchers that were studying them, as well as some Japanese researchers at the CERT who were also reporting on them. So they were kind of making fun of naming conventions, for example. You can see in the screenshots kind of some of the mocking that was going on. So again, these are all mostly harmless in terms of responses, and they seem kind of more personal and, a little bit of an annoyed reaction, but it's just worth keeping in mind that they could be worse, as in, attackers could take it upon themselves to actively target defenders or companies that are doing this research. So it's worth keeping in mind that that's always an option. So just in terms of disclosure, there's a lot of things to consider when you're publishing. Who is this going to impact, and how is it going to impact? Does it put us too much in the spotlight? What is the significance of what we are disclosing? So that kind of leads me on to my next section, which is about consequences of disclosure, which are both intended and unintended. So we've talked about the motivations, we've seen how attackers can respond, but what happens after that that we may or may not be aware of. So we'll start with some of the unintended consequences and then move on to intended consequences. So these are a few examples of unintended consequences. Now, this is just kind of part and parcel of the dynamic that you're going to find between attackers and defenders. And like I said, it's always a back and forth. There's a constant kind of challenge and battle, and defenders are constantly trying to keep up with the attackers, how they change, what they're going to do next, even try to anticipate those operations. And attackers have the same problem, right? So they need to make sure that they go undetected by the defenders, that they're stealthy, and that they're successful, although sometimes, as I mentioned, they don't care. And so, reporting doesn't necessarily have to have an impact on their operations. If they're brazen enough and bold enough and kind of confident in their success, then it's pretty irrelevant at that point. So the first example is that attackers can get inspiration from details that are given in threat reports. So say there's a blog that describes the TTPs of one particular group and says, oh, this is how they managed to compromise this particular target. Well, other attackers could theoretically be reading those blogs and say, oh, well, we haven't tried that technique. Why don't we? So a good example of this is the SMB technique for obtaining password hashes as shown. So this one, this technique has been repurposed by at least 2 other threat groups from different countries. So there were a couple blogs about it. There was a semantic blog, there was a CISA alert, and it just talked about this, rather uncommon, not totally, prevalent around the threat landscape. So we saw it used by a Russian threat group, for example, first, and a little bit later, an Iranian group picked it up. So in terms of, a TTP that isn't necessarily common to very many groups, it seemed like this was a plausible explanation where the Iranian attackers had seen the blogs about the Russian activity and said, oh, that might help us in our operations. Again, difficult to prove, and it could be, many different things. They could have discovered it on their own, but just something to think about when you disclose that other people do see it, including threat groups, and it's possible that they take advantage of it and copycat. So another issue that comes from this, which does complicate defenders' kind of work a lot, is false flags. So this could happen anyway, and threat groups could use, other threat groups kind of TTPs or signatures in their own operations to purposely throw off defenders or investigators, which does happen. But kind of extra detail and disclosures could inspire threat groups to pick up, whatever TTP that is for the purpose of confusing attribution. So this one is actually a really good example. It's quite a prime example, and Talos covered this extensively in a blog and talked about the kind of issues of false flags here. So when Olympic Destroyer was discovered, a destructive malware that was targeting the Olympics, it was unclear as to who exactly was responsible for this. And they go over several cases in their blog where they pick out certain, file names or TTPs or things in the code and kind of extrapolate on what those indicators suggest. So does it point to a Chinese group, North Korean group, a Russian group? And they kind of go through these examples and say, well, this particular file name looks like this particular group. Does that mean it's actually this group responsible for the operation? So after all this discussion, it looked like there were several false flags that appeared in this campaign. And at the end of the day, it turned out to be a Russian group called Sandworm, which was responsible, but they had used both Chinese and North Korean kind of markings or fingerprints in their operations to kind of throw everyone off and confuse them and lead them to kind of false conclusions. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that when you're publicly disclosing, there's definitely the option that attackers pick up the TTPs, not just to copy, but to mislead. And so lastly, we'll cover something that's a bit more recent and is developing really still. So when NotPetya happened a couple years ago, it was pretty massive in terms of the implications. So it's the impact that disclosure and attribution can have on cyber insurance claims that we're going to talk about. And basically, NotPetya was the most financially damaging kind of operation that we've seen. And there's just millions and millions in damages that mostly, resulted in companies in Ukraine and things like that, but was quite global in terms of its impact. And this led to kind of an ongoing dispute. So there were several companies that got impacted by this, but one of them was called Mondelez, which is a US company. And basically, Mondelez, talked to their insurance people, Zurich Insurance, over NotPetya and said, well, we need the insurance money to kind of cover all these damages. And within their claim and within their deal with the insurance company, they said this kind of damage is covered because it talks about damage to computer systems and as a result of cyber operations and things like that. So they thought they had a claim. Now, what happened is that Zurich Insurance came back and said, well, actually, you're exempt from this payout, basically, and we are not going to pay out because the NotPetya incident is considered an act of war. And they invoked the act of war clause in the deal that said this is an appropriate grounds for not paying out because basically the incident in question, the attack is considered an act of war, and that isn't covered. So this is really interesting. Now, it's precedent setting if this carries, for example, because I don't think that's ever happened before. And this idea of cyber insurance is going to become more and more important when these kind of attacks keep happening. So basically, it's kind of interesting here because who gets to decide what an act of war is exactly? And one of the reasons that disclosure is so important in this case is that the US, the UK, a lot of countries kind of came out and did political attribution of NotPetya to the Russian government. So they are officially saying that we are attributing this attack to you. And that, again, has political consequences. And it clearly had consequences in terms of the insurance payout as well, because it's not just a ransomware attack and it's criminal or something like that, in which case the insurance company would likely pay out. But because now we're into this very murky domain of what some people would consider cyber war, this makes it quite complicated. And so the claim and the dispute went to court, and basically Mondelez ended up countersuing, Zurich Insurance for damages for 100 million, and all this kind of stuff. So that's quite playing out, and it's difficult to tell what will happen in future, but whether the establishment of norms together with independent attribution could have an impact on insurance policies. But that's kind of a space to watch because it's becoming quite important. So the next slide, we're going to talk about intended consequences. So there are a lot of benefits to disclosure. We've kind of talked about some of the pitfalls, which are, letting attackers know you're onto them. They might copycat the techniques they see in the blogs. It might cause them to disappear, all that kind of stuff. But there can be benefit as well. So it's really something that disclosures have to weigh for themselves and say, is it worth is the benefit worth the cost? So there is a technical benefit. There's value in sharing kind of indicators and TTPs of attack groups with other people. So the security community in general, so that they can better protect themselves. And obviously these public disclosures are different from private reporting, which is usually paid for, but these are free. They're there for everyone to take advantage of and make sure that their network defenses are up to date, and also give them kind of more insight into the kind of attackers' profiles and what kind of techniques they use. So that's a good example. So basically, when there was an alert that came out from CISA about a Russian state actor targeting network infrastructure devices, after that, there was a decrease in the Cisco Smart Install enabled devices following a Cisco advisory, as well as the UK and US disclosure. So there's some benefit. Again, people are starting to take notice, and they're seeing, okay, well, these products or these services or platforms can be exploited by attackers. So, this is a good time to address them, especially because they're being, targeted. So, in terms of the abuse of those devices, for example, we saw a decrease after that. So that's kind of one of the benefits. And, that's what the government bodies like CISA and NCSC are there for, is to kind of help everyone improve their defenses and make sure that people know what the threats are and what the targets are as well. So another one is kind of a behavioral benefit. So one of the things that we talk about with disclosure is, it's helping to increase visibility of the threat landscape, and it's shining a light on what's kind of happening there. So it does encourage discussion about what's acceptable behavior. There's a lot of collaboration that happens in the industry and in the government based kind of around these actors and the operations that they carry out. So it's important to remember that everyone has different visibility and everyone has different advantages. And publishing, for example, reports on attacker behavior and operations can help other entities, fill the gaps in their knowledge as well. So you're creating a fuller picture for everybody, because again, visibility can be quite varied from organization to organization. So that's a really important one. And next, we're just going to move on to another one of kind of another aspect of disclosures that's come about a little bit recently. And I find it quite interesting because it is kind of a mystery. So here we're going to talk about 3 different examples of mystery disclosures where we don't know who's actually doing the disclosing. So it is difficult to tell what the motivation is as well when you don't know who's behind it. So one really big incident is Intrusion Truth, which is a blog that discusses Chinese activity, all different groups, but they do quite a lot more than just talk about technical attribution. They talk about specific people, they talk about different front companies and organizations within China that are operating these campaigns. And it's kind of interesting to see, clearly you can tell that there's a lot of access there. So, who would have that kind of access to find out that political attribution, for example? But this is an anonymous blog, and it is currently unknown kind of who is behind it. Security researchers, maybe a government. I mean, it's really difficult to tell, but the kind of content that's contained in there has been verified and is accurate. So clearly there's somebody potentially who wants the information out there in the public, but can't necessarily disclose their identity. So that's quite an interesting one. Another one is called DFIR report. So this one is really good too. It has great content, and it talks about really detailed knowledge into kind of forensic investigations of different incident response cases. So particularly ransomware has recently been quite a major threat. And so they've disclosed several reports that talk about really detailed knowledge of, what the attackers do on the network, how long it takes them, kind of the step-by-step movement on the network that they can see. And it's also anonymous. I mean, the data looks good, the content, is able to be verified. And so that's also really interesting. And you have to think about why potentially the disclosures don't want to be identified, but they still want to share the content. And lastly, kind of in 2019, there was a whole range of leaks specifically targeting Iranian groups that came out kind of one after the other in the spring of 2019. And these leaks, had quite a bit of detail. They had, some of them had victim CNC panels, for example. Some of them had tool disclosures. And it was quite in depth, some of them, and they were all from different kind of leak sites and leak groups. So it's still kind of unclear who's behind, each leaking group, or if it's all the same, entity behind all of them. And again, what is their motivation to go and disclose kind of Iranian tools and operations into the public? And again, why they're hiding basically behind anonymity. And, a lot of them claim to be kind of, political hacktivist types who are doing it for a cause because, against the Iranian government, for example. But again, that could be a front. We've seen that happen quite a lot, where states use cutouts to kind of obscure the attribution and have plausible deniability. So that's quite an interesting case. And again, in terms of access, where could the people who are disclosing get that kind of access? Is it something that normal, security researchers would have, et cetera? So there's kind of a lot of questions around that as well. What can we tell from those releases? How do they write? How do they, what kind of content do they disclose? To what depth of, knowledge do they have? So yeah, those are the mysteries that everyone is still trying to solve and keep us pretty interested. So I just want to wrap up with some conclusions now. And it's just based on kind of the trends that we've seen and, in terms of disclosure, what does that really mean, and what we've observed. So one thing is that disclosure is increasing. There's benefits and drawbacks, for all parties involved. I kind of talked about them, imposing a cost on the adversary, that's a good thing. But sometimes letting them know you're onto them could be a bad thing. So there's always kind of, options that need to be weighed, for example. And, there can be different kinds of costs as well. So the technical cost of the adversaries having to burn down their infrastructure, register new infrastructure, entirely change their tool set. So develop new malware, for example, that is actually a lot of work, and it's a lot of time and money and resources for the adversaries. So that's a good thing. It can raise those costs when you do disclosures. And the tactics of disclosure are also evolving. You see that, there were big landmark reports like the Mondian APT 1 report back in, 2013. But actually, it's becoming more and more common to have blogs, tweets even sometimes. You see a lot more fast-paced disclosure as well. And you still see the reports, but in terms of the volume and the kind of turnaround, it's become quite common. And, a lot of companies and governments do that. And as a result, attacker responses also evolve because they're clearly paying attention, and they, will either change up their tactics or kind of have other responses as discussed. Deterrence is more, again, on the government side, but disclosure ends up being a key part of the state toolkit for encouraging responsible behavior. So this, is messaging to other states. There is that aspect of we're signaling to you that we know what you're doing, and we know, the kind of operations and your actions. So be aware of that. And it could obviously, result in more or stronger responses from governments rather than just, disclosing. So it's something to be aware of. And a disclosure can bring follow-on benefit as well. So there's more investigation and collaboration, like I mentioned. It does just increase the general knowledge for everybody. And again, filling those gaps where we have them for visibility is extremely important for kind of threat intel vendors and other security researchers. That kind of sharing is actually really important as well. And lastly, attribution is important, whether it's technical, whether it's political. It does help us to understand the adversary better, and the operations. So, whether it's what they're doing on a network, or, whether it's, what agency do they belong to? So, what motivations might they have? Why are they doing this? Espionage, sabotage, etc. So that actually does make a difference. And it helps us kind of understand the threat landscape and prioritize what threats, would be relevant to kind of what different entities. So that's all I had for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending the talk, and I'm happy to take any questions now. So we have our first question, and the question is, are the government or private entities making the disclosures prepare themselves for intended or unintended consequences? This is difficult to tell because I think it varies across the organizations. I know that personally, we can say where I work, we don't blog that much. We don't disclose too much occasionally, but it's definitely a major concern. So this involves a lot of different parties within the organization itself. So you're going to have to talk to legal, you talk to comms, you talk to the senior leadership, because they think through the kind of implications of what that would mean to disclose. And, is it making us a target for those operations ourselves by disclosing? So I think that's something that's probably discussed in every organization, including the government. And so, I can't speak to exactly what those preparations are, but I would think that they weigh the costs and benefits very carefully. And sometimes, it is better to disclose because it's, achieving some strategic goal. And sometimes it's better not to because, maybe the costs are too high. Any more questions? Feel free to put them in the chat. We have a few more minutes. We'll just give it a little more time to see if anyone else has any last minute questions. Okay, thanks everyone for coming to the talk. I hope it was informative and interesting for you. Thanks again.